Bedrock's world may look infinite, but that's far from the truth. How far can you actually go before the game starts to break? And what we will find once you travel far enough from spawn? We'll start our journey at 2 to the power of 17. The moment we cross this point, an obvious jitter appears when moving. At every distance milestone I'll be testing the same things. Do pistons still work correctly? Do different block shapes render properly? Can you fly normally with an elytra, and how do entities behave? At this point everything still functions perfectly fine. You can play the game as if nothing is wrong, just with a slight movement jitter. I will be using the new vibrant visuals, as this doesn't make any difference, and with the new deferred renderer there are even more things that will break later. We'll be teleporting to every power of 2, so next up is 2 to the power of 18. The moment we pass this point, movement jitter becomes much more noticeable. You can still walk around normally, but the snapping is no longer subtle. Theoretically, past this point you can very rarely fall through the world, but during my testing I couldn't reproduce it. So if you've seen this happen, let me know in the comments. All block models still render correctly, as you can see with the piston. Flying with an elytra is still smooth, range still looks normal. Far spread correctly and entities behave just like they do near spawn. So at 2 to the power of 18 the game is still fully playable. The only real issue is precision jittering getting worse. Next stop is 2 to the power of 19. Past this point, movement is no longer smooth at all. The snapping becomes worse. It's important to clarify that most of what you're seeing is not your character moving incorrectly. It's primarily a rendering precision issue. But here even the actual movement logic starts to suffer. You'll see why once I explain what's really happening under the hood. At this distance you can now clip inside blocks and you can definitely fall through the world. Even elytra flight is no longer smooth. Surprisingly, block models themselves still render correctly, but particles are starting to break. They appear compressed. Entities however continue to behave normally. So you could still play the game here, but it's getting harder. Constant jittering, unreliable movement and the real chance of falling through terrain. Our next stop is 2 to the power of 20. The moment we pass this point the jitter becomes really annoying, and falling through the world starts happening much more often. Here's a direct comparison of movement on both sides. The difference is now obvious. Pistons and redstone still function normally for now. But other block models are beginning to show real issues. The cactus model now has a visible gap. The water caustics overlay is starting to render incorrectly. Torches become especially strange. On one axis they turn into flat 2D billboards, on both axes they disappear entirely. You'll understand the exact reason for this later. Far-right entities however still behave as expected, so technically you can still play here, but it's getting even harder. And remember, this isn't some unreachable distance. With nether traveling and an elytra, a normal survival player could reach this distance in just a few hours. Our next stop is 2 to the power of 21. Past this point movement almost looks like I'm flying while on the ground. It is now just snapping and no longer smooth at all. Also falling through the world becomes extremely common. Pistons still render correctly surprisingly. Torches are now completely invisible, and redstone visibility depends entirely on where it's placed. Other block models show even larger gaps. The cactus makes this very obvious. Entities no longer move smoothly either, they snap around just like the player. The water caustics overlay is now clearly broken, and even flying with the elytra feels jittery. You could still play the game here in theory, but honestly it feels awful just to move around. And another game-breaking limitation appears. You can no longer swim normally. Movement in water only works if you're being pushed by a current, or if you keep jumping constantly. TNT however still behaves perfectly fine. And now let's move on to the next boundary, 2 to the power of 22. It's immediately obvious that past this point the game is no longer really playable. The world becomes mostly unsolid. You can still walk in a few places, but movements feels terrible, because position precision has now dropped to half a block. That means that the game can only register movement in steps of 0.5 blocks. Normal walking is smaller than that, so you often just stay completely stuck. To move at all you now need to sprint jump, use an elytra or switch to creative flight. Fences are now officially 2D billboards. One thing I forgot to test was horses and mounted movement, but since all entities use the same movement system, horses would just suffer the same problem. They'd fall through the world regularly, and also need to move at least half a block just to make a single step. Terrain generation also starts to glitch out here. You can find these massive unnatural pits appearing in the landscape. Water caustics are completely wrong. Most mobs can't move at all, because their movement speed is below the 0.5 block threshold. Shadows are broken. TNT visibly jitters while ignited. Surprisingly, pistons still render perfectly fine. At least the lighter of light is still usable. Overall, you definitely cannot play the game past this point. Even if you manage to take a step, you fall through the world constantly, and most mechanics are already broken. But let's push this even further and go to 2 to the power of 23. Here you can no longer fly in creative unless you're sprinting, and even then movement is extremely clunky. At this distance you can only move if the game registers at least one whole block of movement in a single tick. Anything smaller simply gets rounded away. The world is now completely unsolid. Every other distance related glitch becomes even worse. Particles collapse into a single vertical column. Pistons are now finally broken. Entities instantly fall through the world, because everything obeys the same precision rules. The game is essentially unplayable at this distance. Bamboo gets stretched and looks very creepy. Grass stops rendering entirely and becomes invisible. Terrain still generates with massive holes. And now let me do a quick explanation on what is happening before we move on to the best part. Bedrock Edition, due to its legacy rules, still relies heavily on 32-bit floating point numbers for movement, rendering and parts of terrain generation. Even though the game itself is 64-bit, a single float stores 1 sign bit, 8 exponent bits and 23 mantissa bits, effectively 24 bits of precision. This means that floats have full precision only up to 256. After that, the smallest possible step doubles at every power of 2. So at 2 to the power of 22, precision is around 0.5 blocks. Anything less will be rounded off. At 2 to the power of 23, it gets to around 1 block. Where we are right now, the float can only represent whole block changes. So unless you move an entire block in one tick, the game thinks you didn't move at all. Every time we cross another power of 2, we lose half the precision again. We start at around 0.015 block accuracy, and now we are already at 1 block. Rendering still mostly works because vertices 0 and 1 can still be represented, but that won't last much longer. With the explanation out of the way, let's go to 2 to the power of 24. This is the point where the famous stripe lines begin. At this distance, a float can only represent movement in steps of at least 2 blocks. So every other coordinate gets rounded away, and that means every second block simply doesn't render. When only one axis crosses the limit, you can see vertical stripes. When both axes overflow, it turns into a full checkerboard pattern. From a gameplay perspective, you can't play the game any longer. You can still move with an elytra, but only if a firework pushes you at least 2 blocks in a single tick. Otherwise, the game ignores movement entirely. Anything that does render is visibly stretched and warped near the stripes. TNT no longer works because entities instantly fall through the world. Even placing a torch is a challenge since block placement itself is unreliable. Rain, however, still renders perfectly. That's likely because it's drawn relative to the camera, which is exactly the technique you would use to actually fix the stripe lines. Without external tools, this is effectively the last visible breakpoint. The next power of 2 is 33,554,432 blocks, and that number should sound familiar. It's the same as the packed coordinate limit in Java Edition. Feel free to check out the video I made on Java Edition. The main difference is that Java uses 64-bit doubles, so these precision issues never appear in normal gameplay. Bedrock, however, uses 32-bit floats, so the breakdown happens extremely close to spawn. I even modified the no-team dev clan to use 64-bit world generation, and the behavior was identical. The stripe lines do appear in Java Edition, just a lot further away, because doubles lose precision in the same way, only much later. In Bedrock you can teleport up to 30 million blocks, but the relative teleporting beyond that fails. Nether portals can push you to about 32 million, probably a leftover limit from early Bedrock code. To reach the real boundary at 33.5 million, you'd need to fly manually with an elytra for another 1.5 million blocks, which would take hours. So instead I will use a world editor to set my position directly. Fortunately this works, and here we are at the final limit, 2 to the power of 25. Past this point a float can only represent changes of at least 4 blocks, so rendering collapses entirely. On one axis the terrain turns into flat 2D billboards, on both axes nothing renders at all. Blocks simply can't be represented anymore. Regular movement is impossible, even an elytra with fireworks can't help. The only method that can still move you is a Riptide 3 Trident, because it's the only action capable of exceeding the minimum step size in a single tick. But the moment you cross this boundary you are stuck. The game stamps your position back as you've hit a sticky invisible wall, and if you reload the world you're immediately returned to spawn. This strongly suggests that Bedrock is hitting a limit similar to Java's packed coordinate boundary. At this distance the game can no longer store or update positions correctly, so it returns you to spawn or your last position as fallback. And that makes this point the true absolute edge of Minecraft Bedrock on Windows. And that is everything I was able to uncover about the distance limits of Minecraft Bedrock on Windows. There are many different Bedrock branches, mobile, console, older Pocket Edition builds, so some details may vary, but everything shown here applies to the latest Windows version. Honestly, I was shocked the first time I saw the stripe lines without any modding. This isn't some unreachable distance. With an elytra and a nether you can reach these broken areas in a single day of travel. At the very least the game should be using camera relative rendering and double precision physics, because as you saw the world already starts falling apart just 1 million blocks from spawn. Most of this is probably a leftover from the Pocket Edition days, but Bedrock has grown far beyond that, and these limits really deserve a modern overhaul. If you try this yourself and notice anything I missed, let me know in the comments. It's incredibly easy to test. Just open a creative world and go exploring.